And slaves added a lot to the culture of the city.
Ironically enough, it was the defeat in Saint-Domingue that basically caused Napoleon to change his idea about retaining Louisiana. Saint-Domingue is the richest colony in the center of the North American French Empire, and Louisiana was supposed to be the breadbasket.
Napoleon had no intention of selling Louisiana before he realized that he could not regain control of Saint-Domingue. Louisiana was going to supply food, was going to supply goods, so the solution would be simply to sell it.
I think everyone in Louisiana was concerned they'd lose any and everything they have. Imagine you had land that had been given to you by French and Spanish governments. Then all of a sudden you find out you're American. Now you've been turned over to these people who are always viewed with suspicion.
Americans coming in did not see that these people of color should have the same rights. You know, they were of a lower class.
Whites got the right to vote under the Americans. Blacks did not get the right to vote. There were certain privileges that were accorded to whites that were not at the same time given to free blacks. They protested against it, but again, they were not given it because if you were not white, you were black. It didn't matter whether you were free, you still were considered to be of an inferior status. One of the justifications for maintaining slavery was that slaves were members of an inferior race. How do you explain that if you have a society which is controlled by blacks that's thriving?
So as the Civil War approached, there were different things added to control some of these things that were sometimes quite repressive.
Before the Americans changed it, you had the right to acquire freedom by purchase. That became much more difficult after the American takeover, and of course between 1830 and 1860 it became almost impossible. At this particular period of time when the laws were gradually tightening up and more restrictions were being placed upon mobility, free blacks would no longer come into Louisiana if they had not been here already, and you see a large exodus of free blacks out of the state after 1845.
Recurring over and over again is the notion of exile, and within that exile, a kind of death. A remarkable number of poems actually discuss suicide. After the Civil War, the slaves were liberated, but at the same time, the Creoles of color suffered tremendously. They weren't really accepted by white society, and they weren't really accepted by the blacks, and they spoke French. What they got were Jim Crow laws. They could not be educated in English because they couldn't be accepted in English-speaking schools. So many of them would complete their education in France. They studied Voltaire, they studied the French Revolution, they studied ideas of the rights of man. And when that generation came back, their eyes were really opened to the injustices that were taking place all around them in Louisiana. Creoles of color were the ones who really led the fight in Plessy versus Ferguson.
The thrust of the Plessy case was that in 1883, the United States Supreme Court had ruled that state-imposed segregation was unconstitutional, but private discrimination was okay. If private hotel operators, people who operate